Hello again and welcome back to Module 3 of Projex Academy's Scrum 2021 update. Module 3 and Module 4 will be looking at Scrum changes, as I've called it, this being part 1. Can I please again remind you that when I talk of changes here, I'm really referring to the tightening up and refining of some of the definitions and uses of the various parts of Scrum. That said, let's make a start. So what's no longer in the Scrum Guide? Well, here's one. Do you remember this that you learned from our Scrum Masterclass? The 3 questions that would be answered at the daily Scrum was basically, what did I accomplish since the last daily Scrum? What do I plan to do by the next daily Scrum? And what are the obstacles or impediments preventing me from making progress? All made good sense. It is still broadly true. However, here's the tightening up and refinement. You see, these 3 questions in and of themselves were overly prescriptive and limiting, as if the team, one by one in a round-robin fashion, stand up and say what they did yesterday, what they intend to do today, and any problems they've got, and then go on to the next person. Whereas depending on the nature of the work and its progress or otherwise, we need to have a more flexible way of describing what should happen at the daily Scrum. And as part of tightening the definition of what the daily Scrum is all about, now the purpose of the daily Scrum is to inspect progress towards the sprint goal. In so much as that, nothing has changed, and then adapt, if necessary, the sprint backlog. And in doing so, adjusting the upcoming planned work, that's what you intend to do today and tomorrow and the next day. And frankly, there are many ways to achieve the purpose of inspecting such progress. So don't expect a perfect answer here. What Scrum is now saying is the way in which the daily Scrum is structured and organised is more flexible, giving the Scrum team the ability to tailor it, if you will, to its purpose on that particular day. Another term which you may have heard of is called parking lot after daily Scrum. This normally refers to items that need further discussion or thought. So any conversations that need to take place beyond the event's 15-minute time box. Again, do you remember that? Shouldn't normally exceed 15 minutes. But now the Scrum team can decide when such conversations take place. In other words, having gone through the daily Scrum in a more flexible manner that's seen as more efficient and effective for the Scrum team, when it comes to any items that need to be discussed outside that particular time box, the team can decide when and how such conversations take place. In other words, Scrum is now even more flexible. And now we're on to Scrum Roles. Now you're familiar with these. They normally describe the Scrum Master, Product Owner and Developers. However, this was being misunderstood in some situations. You see, Scrum now defines 3 specific accountabilities within the Scrum team, so that the new emphasis is now that the entire Scrum team is accountable for creating valuable, useful increment in every sprint. Whereas the previous guide stated that the product owner was the lead during the sprint review. Do you remember that? Part of the sprint where very often a demonstration to the customer or users, with the product owner leading that, with the rest of the Scrum team attending, but in a supporting role. Again, that was found to be a little too prescriptive. So the Scrum Guide now has the entire Scrum team, do you remember our definition of that, along with the customers and stakeholders at the centre of this event. Again, I think that's an improvement, allowing the sprint review to be far more effective and efficient. And talking about prescriptive language, let's continue that thought for the sprint retrospective. Now, the overall description of this particular Scrum event has now been shortened simply to focus on 3 key areas. Process improvements, which the original one was also in place for, plus team happiness and cohesion, giving individual Scrum teams flexibility on how exactly they approach the sprint retrospective. Again, so that the event called the sprint retrospective is now more flexible on how that is managed and run. Now, another aspect which you've heard of is the time box for refining the backlog. Now, the previous guide stated that no more than 10% of a team's capacity should be spent on refining the product backlog. Again, somewhat over-prescriptive. Surely, the amount of capacity they spend on that depends on the nature of the sprint and of the product backlog and its features. So it is now the Scrum team's decision on how much time is needed to refine and understand the product backlog items. Again, far more flexible and sensible. However, to remind you that something that is still in place, quite rightly, that it is the product owner who prioritizes those backlog items. So what I'd like to do now is just give you an information slide reminding you about the product backlog, prioritization and grooming. The reason being that a backlog should be sufficiently detailed, emergent, in other words showing the prioritized list of those features needed to be done, estimated and certainly prioritized. You'll be familiar with my graphic here. I've simply called this feature A, B, C and so on and so forth. You may call them features or user stories or requirements. And I've also shown the likelihood that these will be used in various different releases, not just one big bang at the end. Again, I've shown diagrammatically how that may occur, with the highest priority items at the top and the low priority items at the bottom. But not only that, the items at the top will be estimated and understood in a lot of detail, whereas the ones at the bottom will be less clear, possibly even epics, large user stories with not much detail in them. And as they gradually rise to the top, as the work proceeds converting the features into products or services within each sprint, these lower ones become more detailed. So backlog grooming refers to creating and refining, that means adding details, estimating and prioritizing, as I've said here at the top. What does that sort of look like? Well, here's grooming. One example is as part of this, let's imagine feature B or user story B, whatever that is. It was estimated at being 3 story points. Here it's been re-estimated as being 4. Another example of grooming is you might find you're inserting a new item. Perhaps a new feature has been discovered or determined, and this now needs to be prioritized within the backlog. You may simply have existing features which now, as sprints take place, that they need to be perhaps swapped around. In other words, they're both still in the backlog, but they have a different priority. Another example, particularly further down, is where you might have one very large item which is now more fully understood. So that single large feature could be broken down into several smaller, more detailed features. And of course, there may be some features that with the benefit of progress, we can see that aren't necessary or aren't required, in which case, as part of grooming, you may also delete some items. So there we have it, a good place to stop. Do join me on the final and 4th module, where we will continue looking at changes to the 5 Scrum events. Thanks for your time, thanks for your attention. Till we meet up again, from me, Dave, it's bye for now.